Ever get that feeling? Like you're drowning in information, trying to understand something really complex, but there's just too much to take in.
You want the essence, right? The key insights without wading through a mountain of books and articles.
Exactly. You want to be informed, but who has the time? Well, that's where we come in.
This is the deep dive.
Your shortcut to understanding. We take a stack of sources, all about one topic, and we distill them down.
We do the heavy lifting so you don't have to.
And today we're going deep, really deep, into a text that's been around for centuries.
The Art of War by Sun Tzu.
Yeah, I know. You're probably thinking, military strategy, isn't that a bit niche? But trust me, this is one deep dive you don't want to miss. We're going to be looking at excerpts from the original text, of course.
We've also got historical accounts of Sun Tzu's life and his influence, commentaries from scholars across the ages, even mentions of his descendant, Sun Pin, who is also a brilliant military strategist.
We're talking strategy, tactics, the whole shebang. And our mission today is to cut through all the noise and really grasp the core principles of Sun Tzu's thinking.
Why was he such a game changer?
And most importantly, why is his work still so relevant today in fields far beyond the battlefield?
It's surprising, actually, how much of what Sun Tzu wrote about still applies in business, politics, even personal relationships.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself, Sun Tzu. Who was he, really? What do we know about him?
Well, the most detailed early account we have comes from the historian Sima Qian.
Okay.
He tells us that Sun Tzu served King Holu of the Wu state around the 5th century BC.
Right.
And this was a time of serious military expansion for Wu. They had some big wins against the state of Chu, even captured their capital, Yum. Sun Tzu's campaigns were so successful that they actually scared some of the more powerful states up north, like Qi and Qin.
So you basically put Wu on the map, right? Turned them into a real force to be reckoned with.
Exactly.
But it's funny, even the king himself seemed a bit doubtful at first.
Yeah, there's that great line from Sima Qian about the king being fond of words but not able to put them into action. So how did Sun Tzu go from being doubted to leading the Wu army?
Yeah. How did he win the king over?
Well, the story goes that Sun Tzu actually demonstrated his military principles using the king's own harem as soldiers.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and apparently the king was blown away by the discipline and control Sun Tzu displayed. Even with a group of women who were, let's be honest, not exactly trained warriors, he was able to show the king the effectiveness of his methods.
That's a pretty convincing argument.
Yeah, it definitely proved he was more than just a theorist.
So that's Sun Tzu, but then we also hear about Sun Pen, his descendant, who was also referred to as Sun Tzu. What's the story there?
So Sun Pen lived about 100 years after the original Sun Tzu,
Okay.
and he was a brilliant military strategist in his own right. Interestingly, Sima Qian also refers to him as Sun Tzu.
Huh.
And it's possible that Pin was actually a nickname related to a physical disability he overcame. Regardless, he pulled off this amazing victory against his rival, Peng Chuan, which really cemented the Sun Tzu name as synonymous with military genius.
Almost like a title then, the Sun Tzu.
Yeah, exactly. Passing the torch, so to speak.
But the timeline seems a little fuzzy, right? There were these inconsistencies in Sima Qian's account.
That's true. For instance, the text mentions Wu and Yu as enemies during Sun Tzu's time with King Holu. But then Sun Pin's big win, which happened much later, is also sometimes linked to Sun Tzu.
Right.
And to add to the confusion, the art of war itself refers to the Wu-Yu conflict. But the thing is, the earliest solid date we have for Sun Wu that's believed to be the elder Sun Tzu's real name, being with King Holu, is around 512 BC. And he was already a general then.
So the book would have to have been written even earlier, right?
Right. But the major conflict between Wu and Yu really heated up later in that period.
Okay, so what are we saying here?
Well, a lot of scholars think that the text, as we know it, probably came together over time. Like the core ideas probably came from the original Sun Tzu.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual text itself might have been shaped and edited over the years, maybe even incorporating stories about Sun Pin and drawing on later events in the Wu-Yu War.
So it's a bit of a historical puzzle then?
Yeah.
But what's clear is that Sun Tzu's ideas resonated far beyond his own lifetime, right? There were all these later thinkers who grappled with his work and saw its brilliance.
Exactly. And one of the earliest and most influential was Ts'ao Ts'ao. He was a major figure in the Han Dynasty, a brilliant strategist in his own right.
Okay.
And he actually wrote a preface to his own edition of The Art of War.
Wow, that's high praise coming from a guy like Ts'ao Ts'ao.
It really is. He considered Sun Tzu's work to be superior to all other writings on warfare.
He called it the profoundest, right?
That's right. And he specifically highlighted the importance of careful planning and deliberation before taking action,
Hmm.
but also the need to move quickly and decisively once a decision was made. He was really impressed by the clearness of conception and the depth of design in Sun Tzu's strategies.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense coming from Ts'ao Ts'ao.
Yeah.
He was a master strategist himself. He knew what it took to win.
Right, and he even brings up that anecdote about Sun Tzu testing his principles on the women of the court.
That's one of the most memorable parts of the whole text for me, actually.
It really illustrates that Sun Tzu wasn't just an armchair theorist.
He believed in testing his ideas, putting them into practice.
Exactly. And Ts'ao Ts'ao clearly picked up on that.
Were there any other commentators who offered interesting insights into Sun Tzu's work?
Oh, absolutely. There have been countless scholars and military leaders who've studied and interpreted Sun Tzu's work over the centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Figures like Mengshi, Li Chuan, and Tu Yu all left valuable commentaries.
Interesting.
Li Chuan, for example, really liked to use historical examples to illustrate Sun Tzu's points.
Ah, so he put the ideas into context,
Yeah.
showed how they played out in real battles.
Precisely. And Tu Yu, even though he was writing much later, still found Sun Tzu's ideas incredibly relevant. It's amazing how much staying power this text has had.
All right, so with all this historical context in mind, let's get to the heart of it. What were Sun Tzu's core strategic principles?
Okay, so one of the most central and maybe surprising ideas in the art of war is that the best way to win is to avoid fighting altogether.
Wait, what? I thought this was a book about war.
It is, but Sun Tzu believed that the ideal outcome was to achieve victory without bloodshed, without destroying your enemy. He even says, to take the enemy's country whole and intact, to shatter and destroy it is not so good. It's about breaking the enemy's will to resist, not necessarily their bodies.
So how do you do that? How do you win without actually fighting?
Through strategy, deception, and targeting their weaknesses. Sun Tzu talks about capturing cities without sieges, overthrowing kingdoms without lengthy campaigns. He gives the example of Wu Wang, who managed to bring down the Yin dynasty and was seen as a benevolent ruler, not a brutal conqueror.
So it's about outsmarting your opponent, making them surrender before the fighting even starts.
Exactly. And this leads to another key principle, knowing when to fight and, just as importantly, when not to fight.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty crucial skill in any kind of conflict.
It is, and Sun Tzu stressed that understanding this distinction, along with the ability to manage both superior and inferior forces, was fundamental to success. He really elevated the role of the general, seeing him as the bulwark of the state.
And speaking of rulers, it sounds like Sun Tzu had some pretty strong opinions about leaders who meddle in military affairs.
Oh, yeah. He was not a fan of rulers interfering in military operations if they didn't understand the situation on the ground. He called it hobbling the army.
Makes sense. I imagine that could lead to some serious chaos.
It definitely could. He said it would lead to confusion, hesitation, and inability to adapt to changing conditions on the battlefield.
So what did he see as the keys to victory?
He outlined 5 essential conditions. Knowing when to fight and when not to fight, knowing how to handle both larger and smaller forces, ensuring that everyone in the army is united in purpose, being prepared while the enemy is not, and having a military command that's free to operate without interference from the ruler.
Okay, so it's not just about brute force. It's about strategy, timing, unity, and preparation. And of course, one of Sun Tzu's most famous quotes is all about knowing your enemy and knowing yourself.
If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles.
Right. But what does that actually mean in practice?
It means understanding your opponent's strengths and weaknesses, their motivations and their fears, just as well as you understand your own. If you only know yourself, you'll only win half your battles. If you know neither yourself nor your enemy, you're doomed to fail every time.
So knowledge is power, basically. The more you know, the better your chances of winning.
Absolutely. In fact, Sun Tzu says that the most skillful general is the one who achieves victory before any fighting even takes place.
Now that's impressive. How do you win before the battle even starts?
By being so well prepared, so in tune with the terrain, the enemy's movements, your own capabilities, that the outcome is almost a foregone conclusion. You've already outmaneuvered them, outsmarted them, before a single arrow is fired.
So it's about setting the stage for success, creating the conditions for victory.
Exactly. And that takes us to the more tactical side of things. Sun Tzu introduces these concepts of Chang and Qi, which are essential to understanding his approach to warfare.
Okay, so Cheng and Qi. Break those down for me. What do they mean?
Think of Chang as the direct approach. your main attack, your standard operating procedure.
Okay.
Qi, on the other hand, is the indirect approach. The surprise attack, the flanking maneuver, the unexpected tactic.
Ah, I see.
And the brilliance of Sun Tzu's approach is that he advocates for using both of these in tandem. What looks like a direct attack, your Chang, can actually be a feint to disguise your real intention, your Qi.
It's all about keeping the enemy guessing.
Exactly. A great example is Han Xin's maneuver, where he publicly prepared to attack via one route, but secretly crossed the Yellow River somewhere else entirely.
So his apparent preparations were the Cheng, and the hidden river crossing was the Chai that led to victory.
Precisely. And deception is a key theme throughout the art of war.
So it's not just about brute force, it's about being clever, about using your mind to outwit your opponent.
Right. Sun Tzu talks about simulating disorder when your army is actually perfectly ordered, appearing weak when you're strong, and feigning fear when you're actually full of courage.
It's about creating this illusion of weakness to lull the enemy into a false sense of security.
Exactly. A great example of this is the story of Cao and the Xiongnu spies. The Xiongnu, who were nomads, deliberately showed the Han army their weaker units to try and trick them into thinking they were vulnerable.
That's pretty sneaky.
It is, but it shows how effective deception can be in warfare. And another key aspect of this is the idea of manipulating the enemy's expectations, making them react to what you want them to react to.
Right. Instead of letting them dictate the terms of the engagement.
Sun Tzu did this brilliantly in his campaign against Pang Xuan. He faked a retreat, reducing the number of cooking fires in his camp each night to make it look like his army was deserting.
Oh, clever.
Pang Xuan fell for it, thinking he had Sun Tzu on the run, and ended up walking right into an ambush.
Wow, that's playing the long game.
Sun Tzu was all about that. He stressed the importance of always trying to impose your will on the enemy while preventing them from imposing their will on you. Use advantages to draw them in, inflict damage to keep them at bay.
So it's a constant dance of pushing and pulling, baiting and retreating.
And speed is essential, Sun Tzu says. March swiftly to places where you are not expected.
He even talks about achieving a state of formlessness in attack, right? Now, that always sounded a little mystical to me.
It does sound kind of mystical.
But what does it actually mean?
It means being so unpredictable, so fluid in your movements, that the enemy can't figure out what you're going to do next. You strike where they least expect it, then vanish before they can react.
Like a ghost.
Exactly. It's about always staying one step ahead, keeping them constantly off balance. Attack weak points, retreat quickly, never give them a chance to regroup.
And you mentioned earlier that Sun Tzu wasn't a fan of direct confrontations.
Right. He preferred to force the enemy to engage on his terms by attacking something they had to defend rather than going head-to-head with their strongest forces.
So it's about choosing your battles, picking the fights you know you can win.
Exactly. And sometimes the best way to win is to not fight at all. He even talks about using bluff to deter the enemy from attacking.
Like in that famous story about Zhuge Liang and the empty city.
Yes. Zhuge Liang famously opened the city gates and pretended to be relaxed, playing his lute when the enemy was approaching.
Pretty bold move.
It was a huge gamble, but it worked. The enemy commander, thinking it was a trap, decided not to attack.
So sometimes confidence can be the best weapon.
Sun Tzu would definitely agree with that. He also stressed the importance of concentrating your own forces while forcing the enemy to spread theirs thin.
Divide and conquer, right.
Exactly. But all of this requires unity and cohesion within your own army.
Right, because even the best strategy is useless if your troops aren't working together.
Sun Tzu emphasized that harmony and shared purpose were absolutely essential for any complex maneuver to succeed. He actually compares the difficulty of turning the unexpected into the expected and transforming setbacks into advantages to Hannibal and Napoleon crossing the Alps.
Wow, those were some seriously challenging campaigns.
They were, and that brings us to the example of Chaoxi's march to relieve OU.
Right, the artifice of deviation.
Yeah.
That one always struck me as particularly clever.
It perfectly illustrates how a seemingly illogical or roundabout route can actually be the most strategic. Ts'ao, she basically took this winding path that nobody expected, completely outmaneuvering the enemy and arriving at OU in a position of strength.
So it's not always about the shortest path to the goal. Sometimes the scenic route is the most effective.
Right. But Sun Tzu is careful to point out that maneuvers like this require an incredibly well-disciplined army.
Right, because if your troops aren't on the same page, it could all fall apart pretty quickly.
And this brings us to another crucial aspect of Sun Tzu's thinking: logistics.
The nuts and bolts of keeping an army moving and supplied.
Exactly. Sun Tzu stresses the importance of secure baggage trains, adequate provisions, and well-established supply lines. He emphasizes that even when you're advancing, you need to be careful to only move when there's a real advantage to be gained.
So it's about being strategic and thoughtful, even when it comes to the less glamorous aspects of war.
Right, because a hungry army is a defeated army. He also uses these really vivid metaphors to describe the ideal qualities of an army.
Oh yeah, the wind, the forest, the fire, and the mountain, right?
Exactly. He compares the army's speed to the wind, its compactness to a forest, its destructive power to fire, and its immovability in defense to a mountain.
It's a pretty powerful way to illustrate the kind of force he envisioned.
And it's not just about strategy and logistics. Sun Tzu also delves into the psychology of warfare, the importance of managing your troops and maintaining morale.
Right, because war is as much a mental battle as it is a physical one.
He advocates for rewarding soldiers with spoils of war and captured territory to motivate them.
Makes sense. You want your troops to feel like their efforts are being recognized and rewarded.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of using signals like gongs, drums, banners, and flags to maintain communication and unity on the battlefield.
Yeah, in the chaos of battle, clear communication is essential.
Absolutely. And he was a keen observer of morale, noting that it tends to be highest in the morning and wanes as the day wears on. He advises attacking when the enemy is likely to be tired and less alert.
So it's about understanding the rhythms of battle, the ebb and flow of energy and morale.
Sun Tzu understood that war is about exploiting every possible advantage, physical and psychological. He stressed the importance of keeping your own composure, conserving your strength, and carefully assessing the specific circumstances of each engagement.
He even offers some very specific advice on dealing with a retreating enemy.
Right. He warns against pursuing an enemy that's faking a retreat.
Could be a trap, right?
Exactly. And he advises against attacking soldiers who are defending their homes because they're going to fight much harder.
Makes sense.
He also warns against falling for obvious baits, interfering with an army that's heading home, and pressing a defeated enemy too hard.
He uses Ts'ao Ts'ao's own retreat as an example, right?
Yeah, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence and pursuing a retreating enemy too aggressively. He also leaving an escape route when you're surrounding an enemy so they don't feel completely trapped and fight with the desperation of cornered animals.
So it's about knowing when to press your advantage and when to show a little restraint.
Exactly. Then there's his discussion of the 9 varieties of ground.
Yeah, this is where he gets really specific about different types of terrain and how they should influence your strategy.
Right. He categorizes terrain into dispersive, facile, contentious, open, intersecting highways, serious, difficult, hemmed in, and desperate ground.
Quite a list.
And for each type, he gives specific advice on how to approach it. He says you shouldn't engage on dispersive ground, you shouldn't linger on facile ground, and you should only attack on contentious ground after you've secured a good position.
So it's about adapting your approach based on the specific challenges of the terrain.
Right. He also emphasizes the strategic advantage of seizing key positions, like high ground.
There's a great story about Pei Xingqin using a flood to his advantage, right?
Yes. Pei Xingqin deliberately flooded the battlefield, forcing the enemy into a vulnerable position and then launching a devastating attack. It was a risky move, but it paid off.
And Sun Tzu also talks about the 6 calamities, right? The things that can lead to an army's downfall.
Yes, he calls them flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, and rout.
And these all stem from the general's failings, right?
Exactly. He explains that if the soldiers are too strong and the officers are too weak, it leads to insubordination. If the officers are too strong and the soldiers are too weak, it leads to collapse, and so on.
So it's not just about having a good plan. It's about having the right people in place to execute it.
And it's the general's responsibility to choose those people carefully.
To assess their strengths and weaknesses and make sure everyone is working together effectively.
Sun Tzu is very clear about the general's authority. He says that a general should engage in battle even against the ruler's orders if victory is certain, and conversely, they should not fight even if the ruler commands it if victory is unlikely.
Wow, that's giving the general a lot of power.
Sun Tzu believed that the general was in the best position to make those calls, to judge the situation on the ground.
Makes sense. They're the ones with the first-hand knowledge of the battlefield.
Right. And he also stresses the balance between treating your soldiers humanely and maintaining strict discipline.
A bit of a balancing act, right?
It is. He references Yenz's quote about Sima Zhangchu, who was known for his fairness and discipline.
Okay.
And there's also the example of Lu Meng, who executed one of his own men for disobeying orders, even though the man was well respected in their hometown.
That's a tough call.
It was, but it shows how seriously Sun Tzu took the idea of maintaining order and discipline within the army.
And you mentioned earlier the importance of intelligence gathering, of knowing your enemy.
Absolutely. Sun Tzu says that knowing only your own situation or only the enemy's situation only gives you a 50-50 chance of success.
So you need both pieces of the puzzle.
Right. You need to know yourself, your enemy, and he also says heaven and earth.
Heaven and earth, what does that mean?
Heaven refers to the timing, the weather, the environmental conditions. Earth refers to the terrain, the lay of the land. All of these factors can influence the outcome of a battle.
Right, so it's about having a comprehensive understanding of the situation, taking everything into account.
And when it comes to invasions, Sun Tzu suggests that pushing deeper into enemy territory can actually strengthen your own forces.
Really? How does that work?
Because it creates a sense of unity and purpose. Your troops are literally all in it together.
They have to rely on each other for survival.
Exactly. He also emphasizes the importance of taking care of your troops, making sure they're not overexerted or exhausted. He gives the example of Wen Jin, who was very careful about not overtaxing his soldiers during his campaigns in the Chu state.
So it's not just about pushing your troops to their limits. It's about knowing when to rest and regroup.
And sometimes, Sun Tzu suggests, you need to put your troops in a seemingly desperate situation to bring out their best.
That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, but he argues that when soldiers believe they have no other option but to fight for their lives, they can achieve incredible things. It's about tapping into that primal instinct for survival.
So it's a calculated risk, but one that can pay off big time.
Right. He also advocates for being flexible in your approach, rewarding soldiers based on merit rather than rigid rules, and issuing orders without prior announcement to maintain the element of surprise.
Keep the enemy guessing, right?
Always. And he talks about presenting your soldiers with the immediate objective, but not revealing the overarching plan beforehand.
Like Han Xin did in his battle against Ts'ao.
Exactly. He led his troops to believe they were facing certain defeat, but he actually had a secret plan that completely turned the tables.
That's brilliant.
And he also talks about the importance of targeting the enemy's flanks, because that's where you can really disrupt their formations and eventually defeat their commander-in-chief. When you take command, he says, you need to be decisive, secure your borders, stop all emissaries, and be firm and resolute in your council chamber.
So it's about projecting an image of strength and control right from the start.
Exactly. And of course, no discussion of Sun Tzu would be complete without talking about fire and water attacks.
Ah, yes, the classic elements of warfare.
Sun Tzu outlines 5 different ways to use fire attacks, but he stresses that you need to understand the conditions before you use them.
Right, like which way the wind is blowing, how dry the terrain is, that sort of thing.
Exactly. He also talks about using water attacks, noting that while water can be very effective at disrupting and isolating the enemy, it can't destroy supplies in the same way fire can.
Makes sense. And throughout all of this, he keeps coming back to the idea of seizing opportunities, of being decisive when the moment is right.
He says you should only move when there's a clear advantage to be gained, never out of anger or frustration.
So it's about keeping a cool head, even in the heat of battle.
And never forgetting the potential costs of war. He reminds us that a destroyed kingdom cannot be rebuilt and the dead cannot be brought back to life.
A sobering thought.
It is. He stresses the importance of caution and careful consideration in every decision. And finally, he gets to the crucial role of espionage.
Spying.
Right. He says that raising a large army is incredibly expensive, and the longer a war drags on, the more it costs. So using spies effectively is essential to minimizing those costs and achieving a swift victory.
So spies are basically a cost-saving measure.
In a way, yes. He outlines 5 different types of spies. Local spies, inward spies, converted spies, doomed spies, and surviving spies.
And each one has a different role to play, right?
Exactly. Local spies are recruited from the enemy's population. Inward spies are enemy officials who you've managed to turn. Converted spies are enemy spies that you've captured and persuaded to work for you. Doomed spies are sent to spread false information, knowing they will be caught and executed. And surviving spies are the ones who come back with valuable intelligence.
And Sun Tzu uses historical examples to illustrate the effectiveness of different types of spies, right?
Yeah, like Lo Sheng's use of doomed spies and the successful deployment of converted spies by figures like Tian Tan and Chao Shi. He stresses the importance of treating converted spies well to gain their loyalty.
Because they're a valuable asset, right?
Yes.
They have access to information that nobody else does.
Exactly. He concludes by saying that knowing the enemy's situation is priceless.
So to wrap up this incredible deep dive into the art of war, it's clear that Sun Tzu's ideas are about so much more than just military strategy.
Right. They're really about understanding human nature, competition, and the dynamics of power.
He talks about knowing yourself, knowing your opponent, being adaptable, seizing opportunities, the importance of planning and deception. These are principles that apply in so many areas of life.
Absolutely. Think about business negotiations, political campaigns, even personal relationships.
So here's a question for you. What's one area of your life where applying a more strategic approach, maybe even borrowing some of Sun Tzu's wisdom, could give you an edge?
Think about the historical examples we discussed, the different tactics Sun Tzu outlines. How could you apply those principles to the challenges you're facing?
It's really fascinating to think about how this ancient text can still offer such valuable insights for us today.
It's a testament to the enduring power of Sun Tzu's ideas.
We encourage you to explore the art of war for yourself. There's so much to discover in this text, so much wisdom to unpack, and maybe even check out some of the commentaries we mentioned. Who knows, you might be surprised by what you find.
It's a journey worth taking.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.